My name is Emma, and at 32 years old, I thought I knew the man I had been married to for 2 years. We were at the airport, excited about our anniversary trip to Paris, when Michael suddenly turned pale and whispered, "I don't feel well." That's when a security officer looked at me with pure terror in his eyes and said words that shattered my entire world. "You can't be here with him. You're in danger." What happened next revealed a truth so horrifying that it made headlines across the country. If you're watching this story, please let me know where you're from in the comments below, hit that like button, and subscribe to hear more shocking stories about the people we think we know best. The morning light filtered through our bedroom curtains as I carefully folded Michael's favorite blue shirt into the suitcase. Paris in October. I could hardly contain my excitement. 2 years of marriage, and this would be our first real vacation together. Michael had been working so hard lately, staying late at the office, coming home exhausted and distant. This trip was exactly what we needed to reconnect. "Honey, did you pack your passport?" I called out, smoothing down a wrinkle in my favorite sundress, the one he'd complimented me on during our first date. The memory made me smile. How nervous I'd been, how he'd made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the room with just a look. "Yeah, it's in my carry-on," came his muffled reply from the bathroom. But something in his voice made me pause. A tension that hadn't been there moments before. I walked to the bathroom doorway and found him staring at himself in the mirror, gripping the marble countertop so hard his knuckles were white. His face was pale, almost gray, with a sheen of perspiration across his forehead. "Michael? Baby, are you feeling okay?" He startled, as if he'd forgotten I was there. "I'm fine. Just tired. You know how work's been." Work. Always work. For the past 3 months, he'd been getting these mysterious phone calls at all hours. He'd step outside to take them, or disappear into his home office, speaking in hushed tones. When I asked about them, he'd brush me off with vague explanations about difficult clients or demanding deadlines. As if summoned by my thoughts, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Michael's entire body went rigid. "Aren't you going to answer that?" asked, trying to keep my voice light. "It can wait." But his hands were shaking now as he reached for his toothbrush. The phone buzzed again. And again. "Michael, just answer it. We have time." He practically lunged for the phone, glancing at the screen before his face went ashen. I need to take this. Work emergency." He rushed past me, phone pressed to his ear, and headed for the sliding door to our backyard. Through the glass, I watched him pace back and forth across our patio, his free hand running through his dark hair, a nervous habit I'd noticed more and more lately. The conversation lasted nearly 10 minutes. I couldn't make out words, but his body language told the story. Tense shoulders, rapid gestures, the way he kept glancing back at the house, as if checking to see if I was watching. Which, of course, I was. When he finally came back inside, he was trying too hard to look casual. "Sorry about that. Peterson's having issues with the Morrison account." Peterson was his boss. The Morrison account was something he'd mentioned before. It sounded plausible enough, but something in my gut twisted uncomfortably. In 2 years of marriage, I'd never known Michael to get so agitated over work calls. "Everything okay?" I ventured. "Fine. Perfect. Ready for Paris?" His smile was too bright, too forced. Like he was performing the role of excited husband rather than actually feeling it. The drive to the airport was worse than the morning's phone call. Michael gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, constantly checking the rearview mirror. Every few minutes, his eyes would dart to the side mirrors, then back to the road, then to the mirror again. "Michael, you're making me nervous." "What are you looking for?" "Nothing. Just being careful. You know how crazy drivers can be on the highway." But this wasn't careful driving. This was paranoid driving. The way someone drives when they think they're being followed. "Are you sure you're okay? You've been acting strange for weeks." The phone calls, staying late at work, and now this. I gestured vaguely at his rigid posture, the sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning running full blast. "I'm fine, Emma. Really. Just stressed about taking time off. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. Because Michael had never acted like this before. The man I'd married was calm, confident, unflappable. This jittery, paranoid version was like looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. When we reached the airport, Michael's conditions seemed to worsen. His hands shook so badly he could barely get his credit card out to pay for parking. A fine tremor ran through his entire body, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Maybe we should postpone the trip," I suggested gently. "You don't look well." "No." The word came out sharper than intended. He immediately softened his tone.
"No, I'm fine."
"I want to do this. We need this trip." At the airline counter, things went from strange to alarming. Michael fumbled with his wallet, dropping it twice before managing to extract his driver's license and passport. The check-in clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, took longer than usual examining his documents. She looked from the ID to Michael's face, then back to the ID. Her brow furrowed slightly as she typed something into her computer, waited, then typed again. "Is everything all right?" I asked. "Oh, yes, just a system glitch. Happens all the time." But she was still frowning at her screen, and I caught her glancing at Michael with what looked like confusion. Finally, she handed back his documents with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're all set. Gate 23. Boarding begins in 2 hours." Michael practically snatched his ID from her hand, shoving it back into his wallet with more force than necessary.
"See?"
"Everything's fine," he said, but his voice cracked slightly on the word fine. The security line was a nightmare. Michael had always been the type of person who sailed through airport security. He knew the routine, had his laptop out and shoes off before we even reached the bins. Today, he stood frozen, staring at the metal detectors like they were instruments of torture. "Sir, you can put your items in the bin," prompted a TSA agent. Michael startled, then began mechanically removing his belt, his watch, his shoes. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. Other passengers in line began to notice, shooting annoyed glances our way as we held up the process. "Michael," I whispered, touching his arm. His skin was cold and clammy despite the warmth of the terminal. "What's wrong? And don't say nothing, because this is definitely not nothing." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for just a moment I saw something that made my blood run cold.
"Fear."
Raw, genuine terror in his dark eyes. I feel dizzy," he whispered, one hand pressing against his stomach. "Like I might be sick." The line moved forward, and we approached the metal detectors. A security officer stood nearby, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was scanning the crowd with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this job for years. Then his gaze landed on Michael. The change was instantaneous and dramatic. The officer's casual expression morphed into something I couldn't quite identify: shock, recognition, and then something that looked very much like fear. He took a step forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Michael saw it too. The color drained completely from his face, and he swayed on his feet. "Emma," he whispered, "I don't feel well. I think I need to sit down." But the security officer was already moving toward us, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. As he got closer, I could see that his name tag read R. Thompson. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Thompson said, his voice carefully neutral, but with an underlying tension. "Could I see your identification again?" Michael's hands shook as he pulled out his driver's license. Thompson examined it carefully, and I watched his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said, turning to me with those kind eyes that now held a depth of concern that made my stomach clench. "I need you to come with me."
"Now." "What? Why?"
"We haven't done anything wrong." Michael gripped my arm. "Emma, just do what he says." But Officer Thompson gently but firmly pried Michael's fingers from my arm. "Ma'am, please step away from him. I don't understand what's happening." My voice was getting higher, drawing attention from other passengers. "We're just trying to catch our flight to Paris." Officer Thompson leaned closer, speaking in a low, urgent whisper that only I could hear. "You can't be here with him. You're in danger." The words hit me like a physical blow. What are you talking about? That's my husband. Ma'am, I need you to trust me and come with me right now. Please. Something in his voice, a combination of authority and genuine concern, made me nod. As we walked away, I looked back to see Michael being approached by 2 more officers. His face was the color of old paper, and he looked like he might collapse at any moment. Officer Thompson led me to a small, windowless office behind the security checkpoint. The walls were lined with monitors showing different areas of the airport, and there was a desk cluttered with papers and empty coffee cups. Please sit down, he said, gesturing to a chair across from the desk. I want to know what's going on.
Right now.
Where's my husband? What's happening? Thompson sat down heavily and pulled out his wallet. Instead of a driver's license, he showed me a badge. Detective Ray Thompson, Metro Police Department. I'm not just airport security, Mrs. He paused, looking at me expectantly. Davis. Emma Davis. And that's my husband, Michael Davis. Something shifted in Detective Thompson's expression. A sadness that made my heart race even faster. Mrs. Davis, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to stay calm. How long have you been married to Michael? 2 years. We're celebrating our anniversary. That's why we're going to Paris. The word sounded hollow even to me. And how long did you know him before you got married? We dated for about 6 months. Why are you asking me this? What does this have to do with anything? Detective Thompson opened a thick manila folder and pulled out a photograph. Mrs. Davis, I need you to look at this very carefully. It was a missing person poster, the kind you see on telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. The header read, "Missing," in large black letters. Below that was a photograph of a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, blue eyes, and a smile that could have been my own reflection. Sarah Stone, age 28, 6 months pregnant. Last seen with her husband, Marcus Stone, on October 15th, 5 years ago. I stared at the photograph, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The woman looked so much like me we could have been sisters. Twins, even. I don't understand. Who is this woman? And what does she have to do with Michael? Detective Thompson pulled out another photograph, this one a driver's license. The name read Marcus Stone, but the face staring back at me was unmistakably my husband's. Mrs. Davis, your husband's real name is Marcus Stone. And 5 years ago, his pregnant wife disappeared without a trace. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The small office seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in as my vision tunneled. That's impossible, I whispered, my voice barely audible. His name is Michael Davis. I have a marriage certificate. I've seen his driver's license, his passport. All fake documents, Mrs. Davis. Very good fakes, but fake nonetheless. Detective Thompson opened his folder wider, revealing a thick stack of papers, photographs, and official-looking documents. I've been working this case for 5 years. Marcus Stone, the man you know as Michael Davis, was the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. He vanished right before we could bring him in for questioning. My hands were shaking as I reached for the missing person poster again. Sarah Stone. The resemblance was so striking it was disturbing. Same hair color, same facial structure, same smile. Even our clothing style seemed similar. Sarah was wearing a simple blue dress that could have come from my own closet. This has to be some kind of mistake, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded hollow. Too many things suddenly made sense. Michael's reluctance to take photographs, his insistence on keeping our relationship private, his refusal to discuss his past in any detail. Mrs. Davis, I need you to think very carefully about your relationship with Marcus. Did he ever talk about his past? His family? Previous relationships? I tried to focus, but my mind felt like it was swimming through fog. He said his parents died in a car accident when he was in college. He said he was an only child. He never mentioned being married before. What about friends? Old colleagues? Anyone from his past? No, no one. He said he was a private person, that he preferred to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. I thought it was romantic, like he only wanted to think about our life together. Detective Thompson's expression grew more grave. Mrs. Davis, everything you just described is consistent with someone who's assumed a false identity. The isolation, the lack of connections to his past, the focus on the future, these are classic patterns. He pulled out another set of documents. Sarah Stone's friends and family described her relationship with Marcus in almost identical terms. Whirlwind romance, quick engagement, and then gradual isolation from her support system. Gradual isolation? I repeated, but even as I said it, I realized it was true. When Michael and I first started dating, I'd had regular girls' nights with my friends, weekly calls with my sister, coffee dates with my coworkers. Over the past 2 years, those connections had gradually faded away. Michael never forbade me from seeing people, he was too subtle for that. Instead, he'd schedule romantic surprises on nights I'd planned to go out, or he'd mention how much he missed me when I was away, or he'd point out how my friends didn't seem to understand our relationship the way he did. He convinced me to quit my job, I said slowly, the words feeling strange in my mouth. He said we didn't need the money, that he wanted me to focus on things that made me happy. I thought he was being supportive. Financial dependency is another classic control tactic, Detective Thompson said gently. It makes it harder for victims to leave even when they sense something is wrong. Victims. The word made my stomach clench. Was that what I was? What Sarah had been? Detective Thompson, what exactly happened to Sarah Stone? He hesitated, and I could see him weighing how much to tell me. She disappeared from their home on October 15th, 5 years ago. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse was on the kitchen counter, and there were no signs of forced entry. Marcus claimed he came home from work and she was just gone. But you didn't believe him? There were inconsistencies in his story. Neighbors reported hearing arguing coming from the house the night before. Sarah's sister said she'd called her earlier that day, crying, saying she was scared and wanted to leave Marcus, but didn't know how. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then Marcus disappeared? 3 days before we were going to bring him in for formal questioning. Left everything behind, job, house, bank accounts. Just vanished into thin air. I stared at the missing person poster again, trying to process everything I was learning. Detective Thompson, how did you recognize him today? It's been 5 years. I've been working this case the entire time, Mrs. Davis. I've studied every photograph, every piece of evidence. And about 6 months ago, we got a break in the case. New evidence that led us to believe Marcus might still be in the area, possibly using a false identity. 6 months ago. I did the math quickly. That's when Michael started acting strange. The phone calls, the paranoia, staying late at work. We've been conducting surveillance at transportation hubs, airports, train stations, bus terminals. Today was my first shift at this airport, and the moment I saw him... Detective Thompson shook his head. Mrs. Davis, I need you to understand something. You're not the first woman Marcus has been involved with since Sarah disappeared. The room seemed to tilt around me. What do you mean? He pulled out 2 more files, each containing photographs and documents. Jessica Brooks, married to a man calling himself David Miller 3 years after Sarah's disappearance. She vanished after 6 months of marriage. The photograph showed another blonde woman, this one with shorter hair, but still bearing a resemblance to both Sarah and myself. She was smiling in the picture, wearing a wedding dress that looked strikingly similar to mine. Amanda Taylor, Detective Thompson continued, opening the second file. Married to a man calling himself James Wilson 1 year after Jessica disappeared. Amanda vanished after only 4 months. I stared at the photographs of these 2 women, Jessica and Amanda, and felt like I was looking into a funhouse mirror. We all had similar features, similar builds, similar styles. It couldn't be a coincidence. He is a type, I whispered. Mrs. Davis, we believe Marcus has been systematically targeting women who resemble his first wife. The question is why? Before I could respond, there was a commotion outside the office. Through the small window in the door, I could see several people in medical uniforms rushing past. What's happening? I stood up, my heart racing. Detective Thompson opened the door and spoke briefly with someone outside. When he turned back to me, His expression was grim. Your husband has collapsed. They're taking him to the airport medical facility. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur. Detective Thompson escorted me to a small medical facility within the airport, basically a glorified first aid station with a couple of hospital beds and some basic equipment. Michael was lying on one of the beds, conscious but pale, with an oxygen mask over his face. A paramedic was taking his blood pressure while a doctor, a young woman who looked barely out of medical school, made notes on a clipboard. Is he going to be okay? I asked. His vitals are stable, the doctor said. It appears to be an anxiety attack. Elevated heart rate, hyperventilation, profuse sweating. Has he been under unusual stress lately? I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. You could say that. Detective Thompson spoke quietly with the doctor while I approached Michael's bedside. His eyes were closed, but when I touched his hand, they fluttered open. Even with the oxygen mask, I could see the fear in his gaze. Emma, he whispered, his voice muffled by the mask. Michael, or should I say Marcus, we need to talk. His entire body went rigid, and the heart monitor began beeping more rapidly. He tried to sit up, but I gently pushed him back down. I know, Michael. I know everything. About Sarah Stone. About Jessica Brooks and Amanda Taylor. I know who you really are. Tears began streaming down his face, and he pulled off the oxygen mask with a shaking hand. Emma, please. Let me explain. Then explain. Tell me the truth. All of it. He looked around the small medical bay, seeing Detective Thompson standing by the door, the doctor, and paramedic nearby. Not here. Please. Can we have some privacy? Detective Thompson stepped forward. I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Stone. You're under arrest for questioning in connection with the disappearance of Sarah Stone. Wait, I said, surprising myself. Give us 5 minutes.
Please.
I need to hear this from him. Detective Thompson looked like he was about to refuse, but something in my expression made him nod. 5 minutes. I'll be right outside that door. When we were alone, Michael, Marcus, whoever he was, gripped my hand tightly. Emma, I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt anyone. Then tell me the truth. Starting with Sarah. What happened to her? He closed his eyes, and for a long moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Sarah was going to leave me. She found out about some things, financial things, and she threatened to go to the police. We argued, and she said she was taking the baby and disappearing where I'd never find her. And I panicked. I grabbed her arm, trying to stop her from leaving, and she fell. Hit her head on the coffee table. He was sobbing now, his whole body shaking.
There was so much blood, Emma.
So much blood. I felt like I was falling into a dark pit. She died. It was an accident. I swear to you, it was an accident. But I knew no one would believe me. So I buried her in the backyard. And then I ran. The words hung in the air between us, like a toxic cloud. My husband, the man I'd shared a bed with, shared my dreams with, shared my body with, was a killer. He'd murdered his pregnant wife and buried her like she was nothing. What about Jessica and Amanda? His grip on my hand tightened. I never meant to get involved with anyone else. I was just going to disappear, start over.
But I was so lonely, Emma.
So tired of running. And when I met Jessica, she looked so much like Sarah. I thought maybe I could have a second chance. And when she wanted to leave too? The silence stretched between us, and I had my answer. They're dead too, aren't they? Jessica and Amanda. I never meant for it to happen. They were going to leave me, just like Sarah. They were going to expose me. I couldn't let them destroy everything I'd built. I yanked my hand away from his, stumbling backward from the bed. This man, this monster, had killed 3 women. 3 women who looked like me, who trusted him like I had. Emma, please. You're different. I love you. Really love you. I would never hurt you. But even as he said the words, I remembered the plane tickets Detective Thompson had mentioned. Not to Paris, to Brazil. A country with no extradition treaty. Michael had been planning to disappear again, and what would have happened to me when he did? The phone calls, I said, my voice hollow. The paranoia. You knew they were closing in. I was trying to protect you. I was going to tell you everything once we got to Brazil. We were going to start fresh. With another fake identity? Another fake marriage? Until I threatened to leave or discovered the truth like the others.
No.
Emma, you have to believe me. I love you. I stared at this man I thought I knew, this man I'd shared my life with for 2 years, and realized I was looking at a complete stranger. Everything about our relationship had been a lie. The love I thought we shared, the future I thought we were building, all of it was built on the graves of 3 women who'd made the same mistake I had. Detective Thompson knocked on the door. Time's up. As he entered with 2 other officers, I stepped away from the bed. Michael reached for me, desperation in his eyes. Emma, please don't leave me. I need you. But I was already walking away, Detective Thompson's hand gently guiding me toward the door. Mrs. Davis, one of the officers said as they began reading Michael his rights, we're going to need you to come to the station for a formal statement. I nodded numbly, not trusting myself to speak. As we left the medical facility, I could hear Michael calling my name, his voice breaking on each syllable. But I didn't look back. The police station was a maze of beige walls and fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and surreal. Detective Thompson led me to a small conference room where he poured me coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. Mrs. Davis, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, grateful for something solid to hold on to. How long have you known? About Michael Marcus, whoever he is? We've suspected for about 6 months that he was still in the area. We had a break in the case when Sarah's sister hired a private investigator. The PI found some financial records that suggested Marcus had been using multiple identities to access accounts he'd set up before Sarah disappeared. Detective Thompson opened a new file, this one even thicker than the others. But it wasn't until today that we could confirm his current identity. We've been watching him for weeks. Watching him. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. You mean you've been watching me too? We had to be careful. We didn't know if you were complicit or another victim. Based on what we observed, it became clear you had no idea who you were really married to. He spread out a series of photographs across the table. Me grocery shopping. Me at the post office. Me having lunch with my sister 3 weeks ago, the first time I'd seen her in months. This is what convinced us you were innocent, Detective Thompson said, pointing to the photograph of me with my sister. You looked happy to see her, but also guilty. Like you knew you'd been neglecting the relationship, but didn't understand why. The accuracy of his observation was unsettling. I had felt guilty during that lunch, apologizing repeatedly to Kate for being such a terrible sister. She'd brushed off my apologies, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. Detective Thompson, what happens now? To Marcus, I mean. He'll be charged with Sarah's murder first. With his confession, that should be straightforward. But we still need to find Jessica and Amanda's bodies to charge him with their murders. The casual way he said, "find the bodies," made me shudder. These weren't just case files to me anymore. They were women who'd lived and loved and dreamed, just like I had. During his confession, did he tell you where? He gave us some general locations. We have teams searching now. Detective Thompson's expression was grim. Mrs. Davis, I need to prepare you for the possibility that this case is going to attract a lot of media attention. A man who serially marries and murders women who look like his first wife. It's going to be front-page news. I hadn't even considered that aspect. The idea of reporters camping out on my lawn, of having my face plastered across television screens, of being known forever as the wife who survived, it was almost too much to bear. What about the other families? Sarah's family, Jessica's, Amanda's? They deserve to know the truth. Sarah's sister, Monica, has been fighting for 5 years to keep the case alive. Jessica's parents hired 3 different private investigators. Amanda's brother started a foundation for missing persons. He paused. They all deserve closure. Closure. Such a simple word for something so complicated. How do you find closure when the person you loved never existed? when every memory is tainted by the knowledge of what he was capable of. There's something else, Mrs. Davis. Detective Thompson pulled out yet another file. During our surveillance of Marcus, we noticed some concerning behavior. He'd been frequenting places where single women go, coffee shops, bookstores, the library. He seemed to be studying women who fit his preferred type. My blood ran cold. You think he was looking for someone to replace me? It's possible. We found receipts in his wallet for a coffee shop across town. The barista there is a young woman named Jennifer. Blonde, about your age, recently divorced. Marcus had been going there almost daily for the past month. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Not only was I living with a killer, but I might have been on the verge of being replaced. Just like Sarah had been replaced by Jessica, Jessica by Amanda, Amanda by me. We've already contacted Jennifer and warned her. She remembered Marcus, said he'd been very friendly, asking personal questions about her schedule, her living situation. She thought he was just being nice. Oh God. I put my head in my hands. How did I not see it? How did I not know what he was? Because he was very good at what he did, Detective Thompson said gently. Sociopaths can be incredibly charming and manipulative. They study their victims, learn what they want to hear, what they need to feel loved and safe. It's not your fault, Mrs. Davis. But it felt like my fault. I kept thinking about all the little signs I'd ignored or explained away. The way Michael never wanted to meet my friends or family. How he'd subtly discouraged me from pursuing hobbies or interests that didn't involve him. The way he'd react with hurt and disappointment whenever I wanted to spend time with other people, making me feel guilty for wanting a life outside of our relationship. What about our house? Our bank accounts? Our life? Everything will have to be held as evidence for now. But eventually, you'll be able to access your portion of any joint assets. Though I have to warn you, much of what Marcus owned was likely purchased with money from accounts he'd established under previous identities. So even our home, our furniture, our shared possessions were tainted by his crimes. Nothing in my life was truly mine. It had all been bought with blood money. A knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. A young officer peeked in. Detective Thompson? We found them. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Detective Thompson excused himself and stepped into the hallway. I could hear muffled voices, urgent and professional. When he returned, his expression was grave. They found Jessica Brooks. Her remains were buried near a lake house Marcus rented under one of his false identities 3 years ago. I closed my eyes, trying not to picture Jessica's final moments. Had she realized what was happening? Had she tried to run? And Amanda? Still searching. But they found evidence at a property he rented last year. They're confident they'll locate her remains within the next day or two. The next few hours passed in a blur of statements, forms, and procedures. I told Detective Thompson everything I could remember about my relationship with Marcus. Every conversation, every trip, every moment that might provide insight into his psychology or help with the investigation. By the time we finished, it was nearly midnight. The airport, where this nightmare had begun, felt like something that had happened weeks ago rather than hours. Mrs. Davis, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Family or friends? I thought about my sister Kate, about how I'd gradually distanced myself from her over the past 2 years. Would she even want to help me after I'd been such a terrible sister? I can call my sister. Good. And Mrs. Davis? I strongly recommend you consider counseling. What you've been through, the manipulation, the betrayal, the trauma, it's going to take time to process. As if I could ever process this. As if there was a normal life waiting for me on the other side of this nightmare. Detective Thompson drove me to a hotel near the police station. As we pulled up to the entrance, I realized I had no clothes, no toiletries, no money. Everything I owned was evidence in a murder investigation. The Victim Services Coordinator will help you tomorrow, he assured me. They can provide temporary financial assistance and help you start putting your life back together. Putting my life back together. Like I was a broken vase that could be glued back together with enough time and effort. But some things, once shattered, can never be truly whole again. In the hotel room, a generic space that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and fake air freshener, I sat on the bed and tried to call Kate. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely dial her number. Emma? Oh my God, it's midnight. What's wrong? And suddenly I was sobbing, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside me I didn't know it existed. Kate kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't form the words to explain that my entire life had been a lie, that the man I'd loved was a monster, that I was lucky to be alive. Kate, I finally managed to choke out. I need help. Can you come get me? Of course. Where are you? What happened? The man I married, he's not who I thought he was. He's killed people, Kate. He's killed 3 women, and I almost became the 4th. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Give me the address, Kate said finally, her voice steady and strong. I'll be there in an hour. As I waited for my sister, I stared at myself in the hotel room mirror. I looked like the same person who'd woken up that morning excited about a romantic trip to Paris. Same blonde hair, same blue eyes, same face that had made me a target for a killer. But everything else had changed. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, a survivor of something she'd never imagined possible. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Emma, please answer my calls. I love you. I need you to understand. I turned off the phone and threw it in the trash. Marcus Stone, Michael Davis, or whatever name he wanted to use could rot in prison for all I cared. I was done being his victim. But even as I thought those defiant words, I knew the truth was more complicated. The man who'd held me at night, who'd made me laugh, who'd promised me forever, that man had never existed. He was a carefully constructed lie, a mask worn by a killer. And part of me, despite everything I now knew, still mourned for the love I thought I'd lost. The hardest part wasn't hating Marcus Stone. The hardest part was learning to forgive myself for loving a ghost. Kate arrived at the hotel at 1:47 a.m., and I fell into her arms like a child. My sister, 2 years older than me and infinitely wiser, held me while I sobbed out the entire horrific story. She didn't say, "I told you so," though she had every right to. She'd never liked Michael, though she'd been too polite to say so directly. There was something about him, she said as we drove through the empty streets toward her apartment. The way he monopolized your time, how he always seemed to be steering conversations away from anything personal. And, Emma, you changed when you were with him. You became smaller somehow. I knew she was right, though it was painful to hear. Over the next few days, as news of Marcus's arrest spread, I began to see the full scope of how completely I'd been manipulated. Friends I'd lost touch with called, expressing relief that I was safe, but also sharing concerns they'd had about my relationship that they'd never felt comfortable voicing. He gave me the creeps, said my former coworker Linda. Remember that time he showed up at the office Christmas party uninvited? He spent the whole time watching you, like he was making sure you didn't talk to anyone too long or laugh too hard at someone else's jokes.
I did remember that night.
Michael had been charming to everyone's face, but afterward he'd questioned me extensively about every conversation I'd had, every person who'd made me smile. I'd thought he was just being protective. Within a week, the media attention Detective Thompson had warned me about began in earnest. The story had everything reporters loved: a handsome serial killer, multiple victims who looked alike, and a surviving wife who'd had no idea she was living with a monster. The headlines were sensational and cruel. The wife who didn't know, sleeping with the enemy. How many more are there? I stopped leaving Kate's apartment after a reporter followed me to the grocery store, shoving a camera in my face and asking, "How does it feel to know you were married to a killer?" Kate hired a lawyer, David Goldman, who specialized in protecting victims' rights during high-profile trials. The good news, David told me during our first meeting, is that Marcus's confession makes the prosecution's case much stronger. The bad news is that his defense attorney is going to try to paint him as mentally ill rather than criminally responsible. They might try to use your testimony to support an insanity defense. What does that mean for me? It means they're going to try to make it seem like Marcus genuinely believed he loved you and the other victims. They'll argue that his delusions made him unable to control his actions. The thought made me sick. The idea that our twisted relationship could be used to help Marcus escape justice was unbearable. 3 weeks after his arrest, police found Amanda Taylor's remains buried in the woods behind Marcus's former apartment complex. Like Jessica and Sarah, she died from blunt force trauma to the head. The discovery made national news, and suddenly I couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. "You should consider writing a book," suggested my court-appointed victim advocate, a kind woman named Patricia Williams. "Control your own narrative instead of letting others tell your story for you." But I couldn't imagine turning this nightmare into entertainment for others. These weren't just my story. They were Sarah's story, Jessica's story, Amanda's story. And none of them had survived to tell their own versions. The preliminary hearings began 6 weeks after Marcus's arrest. I had to testify about our relationship, about the manipulation tactics he'd used, about the systematic way he'd isolated me from my support system. Marcus sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, and several times during my testimony, he tried to catch my eye. His defense attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Rebecca Harrison, was relentless during cross-examination. "Mrs. Davis, would you say your husband was affectionate?" "Yes." "Attentive to your needs?" "Yes." "Did he ever hit you? Threaten you physically?"
No.
"Would you describe him as loving?" I hesitated, knowing this was exactly what she wanted. "I thought he loved me, but I understand now that what I mistook for love was actually obsession and control." "But he never harmed you physically?"
No.
"Never threatened you?"
No.
"In fact, Mrs. Davis, isn't it true that during your entire 2-year marriage, your husband was nothing but kind, generous, and devoted to you?" I could see where this was leading. He was manipulative. He isolated me from my friends and family. He controlled every aspect of my life. But he did so in ways that felt loving to you at the time, correct? Yes. Almost as if he genuinely believed he was protecting you and caring for you? David Goldman objected, but the damage was done. Harrison was building her case that Marcus was delusional rather than calculating, mentally ill rather than evil. The trial itself began 4 months after that terrible day at the airport. By then, I'd started seeing Dr. Helen Richards, a therapist who specialized in trauma and manipulation victims. The sessions were painful but necessary. I was finally beginning to understand how thoroughly my sense of reality had been distorted. Victims of psychological manipulation often blame themselves, Dr. Richards explained during one of our sessions. They think they should have seen the signs, should have known better. But you were dealing with someone who had years of practice perfecting his technique. It's not your fault, Emma. Intellectually, I understood what she was saying. Emotionally, I still struggled with shame and self-doubt. How could I have been so blind? How could I have been so stupid? The prosecution, led by District Attorney Lisa Parker, presented a methodical case. They established the timeline. Sarah's murder 5 years ago, Jessica's disappearance and murder 3 years ago, Amanda's disappearance and murder 1 year ago, and then Marcus's marriage to me. They brought in experts on criminal psychology who explained Marcus's pattern of behavior, how he selected victims who resembled his first wife, how he used the same manipulation techniques on all of us, how the relationships followed identical patterns of control and isolation. The most difficult part was listening to testimony from the families of Marcus's victims. Sarah's sister Monica described how Sarah had called her the day before she disappeared, crying and saying she was afraid of Marcus, but didn't know how to leave him safely. She said he'd been monitoring her phone calls, checking her computer, following her when she went out alone. Monica testified. She was terrified, but she also felt trapped. He'd convinced her that she couldn't survive without him. Jessica's mother, Carol Brooks, broke down completely while describing her daughter's final phone call. Jessica told me she'd discovered something about David, that wasn't even his real name, and that she was planning to leave him. She was scared but determined. She said she'd call me again once she got somewhere safe. Carol's voice cracked. That was the last time I ever heard her voice. Amanda's brother testified about how Amanda had gradually stopped returning his calls and messages after marrying Marcus. She used to call me every Sunday, he said. We were close. But after she got married, the calls became less frequent. then stopped altogether. When I tried to visit James, that's what she called him, would always have some excuse for why it wasn't a good time. I should have pushed harder. I should have known something was wrong. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to these families describe their loss and regret, I felt a crushing weight of survivor's guilt. Why had I lived when they died? What made me different from Sarah, Jessica, and Amanda? Marcus's defense team tried to paint him as a man driven by grief and mental illness rather than malicious intent. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about his supposed delusional state, his inability to process the reality of Sarah's death, his desperate attempts to recreate the relationship he'd lost. Mr. Stone was trapped in a cycle of grief and magical thinking, testified Dr. Richard Holbrook, a psychiatrist hired by the defense. In his mind, if he could find the right woman, someone who reminded him of Sarah, he could somehow undo the tragedy of losing her. When these relationships inevitably failed to live up to his fantasy, he reacted with violence born of desperation, not calculation. It was a sophisticated defense, but I could see the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear. This wasn't a man driven mad by grief. This was a predator who'd spent years perfecting his hunting technique. When I testified during the main trial, I was better prepared than I'd been for the preliminary hearings. David Goldman and I had practiced extensively, and I was ready for Harrison's attempts to portray Marcus as a deluded romantic rather than a calculating killer. Mrs. Davis, Harrison began during cross-examination. When your husband told you he loved you, did you believe him? At the time, yes. When he held you, comforted you, made you feel safe and cherished, those feelings were real to you, weren't they? Yes, but... And isn't it possible that those feelings were real to him as well? That in his delusional state, he genuinely believed he loved you? I took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Richards' advice about staying grounded in truth rather than getting caught up in the defense's narrative. Ms. Harrison, genuine love doesn't require isolation from family and friends. Real love doesn't involve financial control or emotional manipulation. What Marcus felt for me and for Sarah, Jessica, and Amanda wasn't love.
It was ownership.
And when we threatened that ownership by trying to assert our independence, he killed us. I'm only alive because Detective Thompson recognized him before Marcus could complete his pattern. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Even Harrison seemed taken aback by the directness of my response. Marcus himself testified on the final day of the defense case. Against his lawyer's advice, he insisted on taking the stand. It was a disaster for the defense. Under direct examination, he played the part of the grieving widower consumed by loss. He spoke about his love for Sarah, his inability to accept her death, his desperate search for connection and meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. But during cross-examination, District Attorney Parker systematically dismantled his performance. She asked about the fake identities, the deliberate selection of victims who resembled Sarah, the careful planning that went into each relationship. Mr. Stone, you testified that you were consumed by grief after Sarah's death. But isn't it true that Sarah didn't die in an accident, as you originally claimed? Isn't it true that you killed her? It was an accident, he insisted, but his composure was starting to crack. An accident that you chose to cover up by burying her body in your backyard rather than calling for help. I panicked. I knew no one would believe me. And Jessica Brooks, was her death an accident too? She was going to leave me. She was going to destroy everything I'd built. So you killed her. I didn't mean to. I couldn't let her go. And Amanda Taylor? By now, Marcus was visibly agitated, his carefully constructed mask of grief slipping away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. She threatened to call the police. She said she'd figured out who I really was. I couldn't let that happen. So you killed her too. I had to protect myself. The transformation was complete. The grieving widower was gone, replaced by the narcissistic predator who'd murdered 3 women and would have killed me too if he hadn't been caught. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict in a steady voice, guilty on all counts. Marcus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, He looked directly at me with an expression of such pure hatred that it made my blood run cold. Even now, even after everything, he blamed me for his downfall rather than accepting responsibility for his crimes. The media frenzy following Marcus's conviction was intense, but mercifully brief. Within a few weeks, the news cycle had moved on to other stories, and I could finally begin to rebuild my life in relative privacy. But the process of healing was more complicated than I'd anticipated. The trauma wasn't just about discovering that my husband was a killer. It was about learning that everything I'd believed about myself, my judgment, my ability to trust, had been systematically undermined over 2 years of subtle manipulation. Dr. Richards helped me understand that recovery from psychological abuse is different from healing from other types of trauma. Physical wounds heal in predictable ways, she explained during one of our sessions. But psychological manipulation damages your ability to trust your own perceptions. Marcus didn't just lie to you about who he was. He taught you to doubt your own instincts, your own memory, your own reality. This was exactly what I was struggling with. Even months after his conviction, I found myself second-guessing every interaction, every emotion, every decision. Had that person at the grocery store really been friendly, or were they trying to manipulate me? Was my sister genuinely concerned about my well-being, or did she have some hidden agenda? The paranoia was exhausting. I joined a support group for survivors of domestic violence, even though I initially resisted the label. I'd never been hit, never been threatened with physical violence. But the other women in the group helped me understand that abuse takes many forms. He didn't need to hit you, explained Sarah. It was jarring to hear that name, but this Sarah was very much alive, a vibrant woman in her 40s who'd escaped an abusive marriage of her own. He had you so thoroughly controlled through emotional manipulation that physical violence was unnecessary. You were already isolated, financially dependent, and programmed to doubt your own judgment. The support group became a lifeline. These women understood the shame, the self-doubt, the way abuse victims blame themselves for not recognizing the warning signs. They didn't judge me for having loved Marcus, for having believed his lies, for having been fooled so completely. 6 months after the trial, I received my first letter from Marcus in prison. The return address was enough to send me into a panic attack, and I threw the letter away unopened. But more letters followed, one every few weeks, sometimes more frequently. You don't have to read them, David Goldman advised. The prison system is required to deliver mail, but you're not required to open it. Many victims find it helps to have someone else screen their mail. Kate volunteered for this task, though she warned me that the letters were disturbing. He alternates between professing his love and blaming you for his situation, she told me after reviewing a particularly lengthy letter. He claims that if you'd just answer his calls from jail, if you'd stood by him during the trial, everything would be different. He's completely incapable of accepting responsibility for what he did. This was consistent with what Dr. Richards had told me about narcissistic personalities. Even in prison, even after being convicted of multiple murders, Marcus was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to manipulate me into feeling responsible for his fate. As the first anniversary of that terrible day at the airport approached, I realized I needed to make some major changes in my life. I was still living with Kate, still seeing Dr. Richards twice a week, still afraid to venture too far from my established routine. I was surviving, but I wasn't really living. I think I need to move away, I told Dr. Richards during one of our sessions. Start completely over somewhere where no one knows my story. Running away can be tempting, she replied carefully, but it's important to make sure you're moving towards something positive rather than just fleeing from something negative. She was right, of course. I wasn't ready to make major life changes yet. I was still too fragile, too uncertain of my own judgment. But the desire for a fresh start was growing stronger. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a support group meeting. A new member had joined, a woman named Jennifer, who looked familiar. It took me a moment to realize where I'd seen her before. She was the barista Marcus had been stalking during his final weeks of freedom. I feel so stupid, Jennifer was saying. He seemed so nice, so interested in my life. I actually thought he might ask me out, and I was considering saying yes, if the police hadn't warned me. She shuddered. Hearing Jennifer's story, seeing this living, breathing woman who'd almost become Marcus's fifth victim, helped me understand something crucial. I wasn't responsible for Marcus's crimes, but my survival meant something. My testimony had helped convict him. My story had helped educate others about the warning signs of manipulation and abuse. Have you ever considered speaking publicly about your experience? Asked Dr. Patricia Williams, the victim advocate who'd worked with me during the trial. There are organizations that would love to have someone with your perspective talk to young women about recognizing manipulation tactics. The idea terrified me, but it also felt like a way to reclaim agency over my story. Instead of being forever defined as the wife who didn't know, maybe I could become the woman who survived and helped others survive too. My first speaking engagement was at a small college about an hour from Kate's apartment. I was so nervous I could barely hold my notes steady, but the audience was respectful and engaged. During the question and answer period, a young woman raised her hand. How do you trust your judgment now? How do you know if someone is genuinely nice or just a good manipulator? It was the question I'd been grappling with for months, and I surprised myself with the clarity of my answer. I don't think you ever completely get past that doubt, I admitted. But I've learned to pay attention to how people make me feel about myself. Marcus made me feel special, but also smaller. He isolated me from other relationships and made me dependent on his approval. Healthy relationships do the opposite. They encourage you to maintain other connections, to pursue your own interests, to trust your own instincts. After the talk, several young women approached me privately to share their own experiences with controlling partners. Some were still in those relationships, and hearing my story gave them the courage to consider leaving. Others had already escaped and found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their experience. 2 years after that life-changing day at the airport, I finally felt ready to take the big step I'd been contemplating. I decided to move across the country, to a small coastal town in Oregon where I could start fresh, while still maintaining the support systems I'd built. The decision wasn't about running away anymore, it was about moving toward the life I wanted to build. I'd been accepted into a master's program in social work, with a focus on trauma counseling. My own experience had shown me how desperately needed these services were, and I wanted to dedicate my life to helping others heal from similar experiences. Kate threw me a going-away party, and I was surprised by how many people came. The women from my support group, colleagues from the part-time job I'd taken at a nonprofit organization, even some of the law enforcement officers who'd worked on Marcus's case. It was the first time in 3 years that I'd been in a room full of people and felt genuinely happy rather than anxious. You've come so far, Dr. Richards said during our final session. When I first met you, you couldn't trust your own perceptions, couldn't imagine a future beyond the trauma. Now look at you, you're about to start graduate school. You're helping other women through your speaking engagements. You've rebuilt relationships with family and friends. You should be proud of yourself. Pride wasn't something I was comfortable with yet, but I was beginning to understand what she meant. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about reclaiming your life, your voice, your sense of self-worth. The move to Oregon was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in years, I was completely on my own, responsible for every decision without having to consider how it might affect anyone else. I rented a small apartment 2 blocks from the ocean, and every morning I walked along the beach before classes, breathing in the salt air and listening to the rhythm of the waves. Graduate school was challenging but rewarding. My professors and classmates knew my story. It was impossible to hide in such a small program, but they treated me as a colleague rather than a victim. My lived experience was seen as an asset rather than a liability, and I found myself becoming increasingly confident in my academic abilities. During my second semester, I met Tom Peterson in a statistics class that neither of us particularly enjoyed. He was a fellow social work student, a quiet man with kind eyes who decided to change careers after working in corporate finance for 10 years. What drew me to him initially wasn't romance, but his genuine interest in social justice and his respectful, unassuming personality. Our friendship developed slowly. We studied together, grabbed coffee between classes, complained about difficult assignments. Tom knew my story, but never made me feel like a victim or treated me like I was fragile. He respected my boundaries without making a big show of it, and he encouraged my independence rather than trying to take care of me. I like that you have your own life, he told me one evening as we sat on the beach watching the sunset. My ex-wife always wanted to be together every minute of every day. It was exhausting. The contrast with Marcus was stark. Where Marcus had slowly isolated me from other relationships, Tom encouraged me to maintain friendships with classmates and neighbors. Where Marcus had been possessive of my time and attention, Tom respected my need for solitude and independent activities. Where Marcus had made me feel like I couldn't survive without him, Tom made it clear that he valued me as an equal partner, not a dependent. It took me nearly a year to admit that I had romantic feelings for Tom, and another 6 months to risk acting on them. The first time he kissed me, I had a panic attack, not because of anything he did wrong, but because intimate physical contact triggered memories of my relationship with Marcus. Tom was patient and understanding. He didn't pressure me to move faster than I was comfortable with, and he didn't take my trauma responses personally. When I had nightmares, he held me until I calmed down. When I needed space to process difficult emotions, he gave it to me without complaint. Healing isn't linear, he reminded me during one particularly difficult night when I'd woken up screaming Marcus's name. You don't owe me anything, Emma. I'm here because I choose to be, not because you need to perform recovery for my benefit. These words might have sounded rehearsed coming from someone else, but from Tom they felt genuine. He'd done his own work in therapy after his divorce, and he understood the difference between healthy support and codependency. The third anniversary of Marcus's conviction passed with less fanfare than I'd expected. I marked the day by visiting the beach and thinking about Sarah, Jessica, and Amanda, the women who hadn't survived to rebuild their lives. I felt grateful to be alive, but also aware that my survival carried a responsibility to honor their memory by living fully and helping others escape similar situations. That summer, I received word that Marcus had died in prison. He'd been stabbed by another inmate during what appeared to be a random altercation. My first emotion was relief. He couldn't hurt anyone else, couldn't write any more manipulative letters, couldn't haunt my dreams with the possibility of eventual release. But I also felt a strange sadness. Not for Marcus himself, but for the waste of it all. For lives lost, countless families destroyed, all because one man couldn't accept that he wasn't entitled to own another person's love. I didn't attend any kind of memorial service, didn't speak to reporters about his death, didn't waste time processing complicated feelings about his demise. Marcus Stone had taken enough of my energy over the years. His death was simply the final period at the end of a very long, very painful chapter. By the time I graduated with my master's degree, Tom and I had been together for over a year. Our relationship was nothing like the intense, all-consuming passion I'd experienced with Marcus. Instead, it was steady, supportive, and built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility. We challenged each other intellectually, supported each other's goals, and maintained our individual identities even as we built something together. Will you marry me? Tom asked one evening as we walked along our favorite stretch of beach. It was a simple proposal, without fanfare or elaborate planning. Just two people who'd found something worth preserving in each other. Yes, I answered without hesitation. For the first time since that terrible day at the airport, I felt completely certain about a major life decision. Our wedding was small and intimate, just immediate family and close friends. Kate served as my maid of honor, and Dr. Richards attended as a guest. It was a celebration of healing and new beginnings rather than a fairy tale ending, and it felt perfect for who we'd both become. During my vows, I spoke about second chances and the courage it takes to trust again after betrayal. Tom spoke about the difference between loving someone and claiming ownership of them. There wasn't a dry eye in the small chapel, including my own. 5 years after that life-changing day at the airport, I was working as a licensed clinical social worker, specializing in trauma therapy for women who'd experienced domestic violence and psychological abuse. My client caseload was full, and I had a waiting list of women seeking help. Tom and I were talking about starting a family, something I'd never thought possible during the dark days after Marcus's arrest. The work was challenging but deeply fulfilling. Every woman I helped heal felt like a small victory against the Marcus Stones of the world. Every client who learned to trust her own judgment again was a testament to the human capacity for resilience and recovery. I still had difficult days. Certain triggers, a particular cologne, a specific type of manipulation tactic, news stories about domestic violence, could send me into an emotional tailspin. But I'd learned to recognize these responses as part of my healing process rather than signs of weakness or failure. The final letter I received from prison came not from Marcus, but from his estate lawyer. He'd left me everything, what little money remained in his accounts, personal possessions that had been held as evidence, even the rights to his life story. It was a final manipulation attempt, a way to force himself back into my life, even after death. I donated the money to organizations that helped domestic violence survivors, the personal possessions I had destroyed. And I firmly refused all offers from publishers and filmmakers who wanted to tell our story. This story wasn't Marcus's to tell anymore. It wasn't even entirely mine. It belonged to all the women who'd lived through similar experiences, all the families who'd lost loved ones to intimate partner violence, all the survivors who were still finding their way back to themselves. On quiet evenings when Tom was reading and I was grading papers or writing treatment plans, I sometimes reflected on the strange trajectory my life had taken. 5 years ago, I'd been a different person entirely, isolated, controlled, living a lie without even knowing it. The woman I'd become through surviving that experience was someone I actually liked and respected. I'd learned that love doesn't require you to lose yourself. That trust, once broken, can be rebuilt on stronger foundations. That surviving trauma doesn't make you a victim forever. It can make you a warrior for others who are still fighting their way out of darkness. The scar tissue from those terrible years would always be part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was Emma Peterson now, therapist, wife, survivor, advocate. I was living proof that it's possible to reclaim your life from even the most devastating betrayal, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin after you think the story is over. Standing on my favorite stretch of Oregon coastline, watching the sun set over the Pacific with my husband's hand warm in mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before I met Marcus Stone. Complete contentment with who I was and where my life was heading. The future stretched out before me, full of possibility and promise, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to embrace it. What would you have done if you discovered the person you loved most was capable of unthinkable evil? Would you have seen the warning signs that I missed? If this story made you think twice about the people in your own life, please like this video and subscribe for more true stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about trust and betrayal.